Hello, my name is Ashley Bennett, and I am a Sigma architect at Aimpoint Digital. Today, I'm going to walk you through the solution for week 29 of this year's Workout Wednesday for Sigma. This week, we're going to create a business glossary with a request and approvals process that utilizes Sigma's new insert rows action for tabular inputs. Let's get started. First, we're going to add an empty input table. And I'm going to call this my behind the scenes history table. I like to call it BTS for short. And it needs the following inputs. We need a text. Actually, I'm going to make this a single select. That will be our different domains. And then I want to call this domain First, we're going to create our hidden data structure. I'm going to start with an empty input table, and I'm going to call this my behind the scenes history table. I like to call it BTS for short. And I would like to first add a single select column. I'm going to call this domain, and I'm going to add a few different domains that might be in our organization. Great. Check. Yep. Awesome. Also going to make sure we only have one row for the time being. And then I want to add a text column that we're going to call term, and add another column using Shift plus because I want this to be text. And I'm going to use Shift R to rename it definition. And then one more Shift plus and Shift R for review comments. And then I'm going to add another single select text column. And I want to add in my different statuses. And then I am going to add in two more text columns. Shift plus, rename, we're going to call this request ID input, and one more to Shift R to name it term ID input. And now I would like to add some system columns. We want to add that row ID, and we're going to rename this request step ID. And then I would also like to add in my other row history columns, just to help with tracking everything. Don't really need last updated at and by, but they can be good for best practices. I am going to rename my created columns to activity timestamp and activity by. Activity by will be an email, which if you're in Sigma Public isn't very fun to look at. We could do something with that, but for the length of this video, I'm not going to. And then after that, we are going to add some calculation columns. There are portions of this workflow where we will be pushing along a request ID and a term ID, but also portions where we're not. So we're going to coalesce some things to make sure the right ID is taken. So we're going to take our request ID final, and we're going to coalesce our input with our request step ID, because if the request ID input is null, we're going to assume it's the very first step in the request, so it should be the same as our request ID. And then same with the term ID. We're going to add one more calculation column. I'm going to put in a very similar coalesce statement. And I'm going to rename this to our term ID final. And before we move on, I'm going to manually add some dummy data so we have something to see as we're working. Because our workflow does require us to have different timestamps, I'm going to just add a few different rows beforehand, so our timestamps are all slightly different. Okay, now we should have some data for our activity stream. And now let's create a child table to group all this together and see some how it all fits. I'm going to first add a grouping for not term. I want to add a grouping for my term ID final, which I'm really just going to call term ID from here on in. And then another one for our request ID. Again, delete that final. And then in our ungrouped calculations, we'll also do some stuff. But I'm first going to start with the request ID calculations, and I'm going to add a calculation on activity timestamp. I don't want this to be a count. I want this to be a minif, and I want the activity status, not activity, is in review. And I'm going to call this my request created. And I'm just going to Shift D to duplicate that. And I would like a max if the status is approved. And this will be my request approved. And then I'm going to want one more that is just a max of my activity timestamp. And this will be our request latest activity. And then I want to find my request status. I could do this in one column, but I find it's a little bit easier if I pull it out into two, because I reuse this calculation. This is my current status intermediary column, and this will find the status of my latest timestamp. And then we can use that to build my request, my actual request status. So I'm going to Shift plus and add that in when I am done with my terms. Now I'm going to create some calculations at my term level, and I'm going to create find my term created, which will be a min of my request created. I'm going to rename that to term created, and I'm going to add another one that is my max of request approved, and I'm going to Shift R to rename this term last approved, because there can be many approvals per single term. And then I am ready to go back to my request and add in another calculation. I'm going to add one more here. That is finding the request status. First, I'm going to add an intermediary column that looks for the status of the latest timestamp, and that will be my current status intermediary. And then I want to find my request status. I'm going to use Shift plus and paste that in. And the reason that I'm using an intermediary column is because I'm using that logic more than once, so I don't have to duplicate using it if I were to need to update it later. And I'm going to rename this request status. And then from there, I can create some calculations in my ungrouped area. And I'm going to first find the request's latest activity. And I'm just looking to see that the activity timestamp equals the request's latest activity. Rename this is request's latest activity. And then I'm going to want another one, Shift plus. I'm going to paste in a similar thing to find our term last approved, but this might be null. So rather than return nulls, I'm going to assume that it's false, and because the term has never been approved. And I'm going to Shift R to rename this is latest approved. And then open review, I want to see that the request steps status is in review and the request steps activity timestamp is greater than when the term was last approved, if it was ever approved, and the request status is in review. And if that is true, then we will determine that this request step is an open review. And that is my grouped table. I am going to rename this so that it has a distinct name from our parent input table. I'm just going to call it my detail because I'm adding lots of detail. And then I am going to add a child table. And this child table is just filtering out some stuff because all of our parents downstream, we don't want to see the same things. I'm going to filter it once before making more children. I like to have a nice long lineage sometimes. So I'm going to filter to only show a request's latest activity. And so I'm going to click on the column and use Shift F to filter it only to true. And then I also want to only have statuses that are not decline or retired. So I am going to find my request status, and I will Shift F again, and I want to exclude values. When I exclude declined, we don't have any retired in here, so I'm just going to manually add it, making sure that it is the exact same as what would show up. And actually, okay. Now with that, I am ready to create some parent tables for our downstream workflow. I'm going to create one parent table that will be called my business glossary parent. And I want to filter this to is latest approved. I'm going to use Shift F and only show trues. And then I want one more parent. Go ahead and just move it over here. And this will be my review parent. And I want this to be only open review. So I'm going to Shift F and only show trues. Great. Now my underlying data structure is ready for me to create some visible elements. First, I'm going to create a child off of my business glossary parent, and I'm going to rename this business glossary immediately. And then I'm going to make sure I'm only showing what I want to show. I want to show domain, term, definition, and term created, term last approved, and then I want to show, I want to keep the term ID, request ID, and then I believe I can get rid of the rest of these. Okay. I will add some more columns, but first I need to create the next step. So we're going to put that on pause and come back to it later. I am also going to add an action column. I want it to be my very first column, and I'm just going to call this edit term. And let's see, I'm going to go ahead and add a dummy column without a formula, and we're going to call this is being edited. This will refer later to our request table. And I'm, for now, just going to label this true so that we can see something. Be in our edit term. Why are you? That's why. True. And then over here. Let's change this. There, I want to see something. Excellent. And now I like those to be centered. And I'm going to move this to a new page. I'm going to call my first page data, and we will hide the page. My second page will be my business glossary. And I'm going to format my table a bit. I want to hide the title because I'm going to add one in later. I'm also going to hide my summary bar. I think it looks a little cleaner. And then I realized that I did miss adding another calculated column to my detail. I'm going to go back and add one more under the term grouping, and this will be term has pending updates. And this is just a count of open reviews and checking if that's greater than 0. Okay, and with that, now we can highlight, add some conditional formatting to all of our columns. We're going to hide some here in a second. And I want my custom formula to be term has pending updates. Excellent. And I also want to hide things because people don't need to see everything. I'm going to hide all of these. And now I am going to arrange my page a little bit. I'm going to add in a text header. I like to use a medium heading, and we're going to call this approved business terms. And for good measure, I'm going to add in a little popover with information. and that is under layout. And I pop over here. I want to use an icon. I love that they have an icon library available to us now because I can just use an info circle. And I like to set this to text. It looks very nice and clean. And then I can set my popover. Let's go edit my popover, add in just some text. And here we go. And this will be my main instructions. Beautiful. That's all that I need for this page. I am now ready to add in my next page, which my next page will be request or edit term. Edit a term. This will be visible to the end user, so I want to make it very clear and user-friendly. And I want to duplicate my history table as a starting point. I'm going to go ahead and move this to my request or edit term page, and this will be called request terms. And what I need from here, I need to keep the domain, term, and definition. And I also need to keep that term input column. The request input is not needed because requests here will start a new request sequence. And then I need to keep that activity timestamp and by. And then I'm going to rename this. It is not the request step ID, not just the request step ID. It is also that request ID. So there's that. And then I'm going to add some calculations. I am keeping that term ID final calculation that is going to take either that term ID input or the request ID. And then I want to add in, let's see, I don't need these columns. I'm going to just go ahead and get rid of them. And I'm going to add in another calculation column. This is going to be called has changes, and I want to check, sorry, almost forgot. I actually need duplicates of each of our three main inputs. I'm going to shift D on these columns, and I'm going to call them original versions. And shift D, shift R to rename, and shift D, shift R to rename. And then might as well just move them all by themselves. And now I want to, in my has changes, I'm going to use a formula to check and make sure that if the term is being edited, that we actually have changes in our values. We are going to hide everything but these first three columns. So when there are changes to something, we will see that changes have been made. And then the last thing that I need to do is add one more calculation column, and we're going to check that not only do we have changes, but our three inputs have value. And that means that this column or this row is ready to submit. I'm going to go ahead and hide everything except our three main inputs. I'm going to use Shift H to hide them. And I would like to add some summary values. I want to add a new summary that is counteth ready to submit, and I would like to Shift R and call this number ready to submit, and then add one more, not that way. Let's Shift D, and this will actually just be total requests, so we just need a count. And I'm going to Shift R and call this total requests. Okay. Now I want to do some more formatting. For my final formatting, I just want to show those 3 columns. I'm going to also add in some conditional formatting. And on my conditional formatting, I want to highlight any rows that are ready to submit. Let's highlight all the columns that are visible, and we'll do ready to submit so we can see our one column is actually ready. And then I'm going to hide the summary bar and the title, and I'm going to clear out some data. I'll keep the one that is actually ready to submit for now. And then I want to finish off my page. I'm going to add a very similar popover. So it's under layout. Add in a popover over here. I'm going to make it nice and small. Yes, I know it's below the size you recommend, but it's for an icon. And this will be, again, my info. And these will be just instructions. And I want this to be request instructions. And I want to add in text with some instructions. Keeping it simple. Okay. And let's add in our title. Similarly, medium heading. I'm going to call this request or edit a term. And then I want to add a button. It's under UI. I want to add a button to submit requests. We could just say submit requests, or we could use some dynamic text to make it very clear to the end user what they're going to do. Why did that not work? I'm going to hit equals, and I want to look and see if the number that is ready to submit is greater than 0, and I will tell the user that they are submitting a specific number of rows. Otherwise, there's nothing to do. And then there we go. You can see my button looks right. And the actions for this button will be, I want to insert rows. I want to insert from source data into my behind the scenes table from my request terms table. And I want to do column matches criteria where ready to submit is equal to true. And what I want to submit will be domain, term, definition. Review comments is actually just going to be empty. And the status will be in review. And then I want my request input. I want my request input to be my request ID. And then my term input to be my term ID final. Great. Now I can, and then the last action that I want to do is I want to delete rows from that table. that have already been submitted so they don't accidentally get resubmitted. So I'm going to delete from request terms where formula column value matches. We want to look at ready to submit is equal to true. Now that that is ready, I'm going to call this submit, and my action sequence will be submit. We're handling our conditions in our insert and deletes, so we don't need to actually add them to the action sequence itself. So I'm gonna just test this and click submit request. And you should see it disappear from here. Great. If we go back to our data, we should see it over here. If I sort by activity timestamp greatest, you see that row we just made. Excellent. Now, what I want to do is I want to return to my request page, and I would like to add a KPI. Let's go ahead and add in a dummy row and just add in some info of garbage, but I want to add now a KPI that will be a child chart KPI. And what I want to do is make sure that my 2 summary columns are ready and available. I want my value to be ready to submit and comparison to be total requests, but I don't want to aggregate them because they're already aggregated. So now I'm going to also add in a color on my value. And I want the custom formula to be total requests is greater than number ready to submit. And if so, I'm going to make it red. And then if it is equal, I'm going to make it green. Okay. I want to format this a little better for our purposes. So I'm going to change this to just ready to submit. And I want the display to be a % of with no direction. And then I want the label to be of total requests. And my comparison under layout, I want my comparison to be to the right so that I can put this up as small as possible and still see it. So let's move things around, make it look all nice and pretty, the way I want it to look. Everything, yeah, great. And then that is our request page. From here, I can go back to my main page and add in that action. I am going to first update my is being edited column, and I want to put in that formula that will look up the count where the term ID is found in that request terms input table. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to format, has pending updates. I don't want that to be green. I would like that to be orange because that's more of a, hey, there's something going on here. And then I can add in my action. When they click edit term, we want to go on insert the row into our request terms page. And what I'm going to do is first add a condition. There we go. And I want that condition to be is being edited is equal to false. And then if that condition is met, we're going to insert rows. We could use insert row because it's a single, but I like to use this. It's a little easier, even when you're doing just a single row. I want to insert source data into the behind the scenes table, into the request table from our business glossary, and I want the formula to be the selected request step ID matches the request step ID. Why is that not found? Did I not keep it? Sure did not. Let's go and add that back in. ID, request step ID. We need that. Right. Okay. Now let's go back and make sure we can do this. Yes, there we go. Then our selected request step ID to match the request step ID. And we're going to insert from into, and we want the domain, term, definition, and then our original will be domain, term, definition, because that's how we're going to track if there's changes. And we want our term ID input to be our term ID. Now we can go and add our review request page, our final step in this whole process. Add a new page at the end, and I'm going to call this review requests. And the first thing I'm going to do is add in a control. I want this to be a checkbox, and I'm going to call this rev decline all. I like to prefix all of my controls so that it is very clear what step in the process it is referring to. And I'm going to label this as decline all unmarked. And then I would like to create a linked input table from our parents. I'm going to go back to our data page, go to my review parent, and create a linked input table. I want my primary key to be the request ID. And then from here, I also want to be sure I show domain, term, definitions, and then I also need that term ID, and I believe that's it. We can add more later if we decide we need them. And then I'm going to move this to my request page, or review page, sorry. And I'm going to call this review requests linked input table. Okay. I'm going to hide my IDs. The end user doesn't need to see that. And then I'm going to add an input column for review comments. This will just be a text column. And then I want to add a checkbox. I'm going to call this mark for approval. And then I need to add a calculation column to see if the row is actually marked for review. Whether that review be an approval or a decline doesn't matter. And we're going to call this marked for review. And this can stay hidden as well, but let me show you what this does is if this control is checked, then everything will be true. And if it is not checked, then only things that are actually marked for as approval will be marked for review. I'm going to hide that. And then I am going to add some actions to help users check boxes in the when they're in publish mode, so that they don't have to remember to click edit data. I always like to do this. I like to add a condition where it is marked for approval. Sure, let's start with null, and we'll set, not set, we will update row, formula, and I would like selection request ID equals request ID. And I want to set mark for approval, static value. If it's null, we're going to set it to true. And then I'm going to duplicate. If it's equal to false, I'm going to do the same thing, set it to true. And then one last time, if it's equal to true, I'm going to set it to false. And then with those actions, those are just some nice user-friendly actions to add on any checkbox columns that are editable in publish mode. From there, I'm going to add some summary calcs to my table. I want to add the number that is marked for approve, which will just be a count of mark for approval. Rename this number mark for approve. I'm going to duplicate that to do marked for decline, and its calculation will be slightly different. If our box is checked, then it will be a count of all minus that approve, otherwise it will be 0. And then I want to figure out my button text automatically. Here, I just find it a little easier sometimes to do in a table. And I'm going to rename this as button text. And what this is if marked for approve plus marked for decline is greater than 0, then we will do approve and say the number, and decline and say the number. Otherwise, there's nothing to do. So if I uncheck these, there's nothing to do. If I check this, we will approve 1 and decline 0. If I check this, we can't see it, but it should say decline 3. Okay, and now to finish off my page, I'm again going to add another popover. I'm going to go back and just duplicate this popover and move it to my request page, so I don't have to redo a bunch of stuff. I'm going to edit this. This will be my review instructions. And on my review instructions, I need to update them. Okay. There we go. And I'm going to add in my lovely title text, medium heading, and we're going to call this review requests. And I also need a button. Make this smaller and add in a button whose text is just dynamic. That is my button text. And I'm going to go ahead and format my table in a similar format. I'm going to hide that title, hide that summary bar, and that looks all nice. Now I'm going to finish up my workbook, arrange everything exactly how I like it. I'm going to go into my workbook settings, And under workbook navigation, I'm going to add a header and a sidebar. I want my header to be the primary. So that's where I'm going to put my title. We're going to call this Business Glossary. We could add whatever else we wanted in here. And then in my sidebar, I'm going to add a navigation element. I want this to be vertical. Let's go ahead and make it large. And we can make it whatever we want. I'm going to make it a pill. And then I'm also going to give it a little bit more of a personal flair in my workbook settings. Maybe let's change my colors, just swap the preset. You know me, I love purple, and we don't have any sequential or any colors like that. This all looks nice to me. Now I'm going to publish and go through the process. So we can see our approved business terms. We only have a couple, but we see we also have one that has an open request. I am going to just go ahead and edit the other one. And that's been added to my my request page. You'll see that the edit term is gone, and I can go to the request page. I can see the one that was already there, and then I can also go in and just change something. I have an empty row here. I'm going to add in a new sales term, and this will be anything I feel like, just garbage. Okay, but we'll see that this one here is not ready to submit. I could go ahead and submit my 2 requests, and we should see that 2 of them disappear, and the one that's not been changed is not ready. And I'm just going to go ahead and say this is actually a marketing term and submit that request too. Now, I am going to go in and review requests, and I see, I see several requests. I'm going to decline all that's unmarked and say not ready, no way, and approve the rest. And you'll see that my button text does indeed say that I am approving 5 and declining 2. If I uncheck this, I will just be approving 5 and declining 0. So I'm going to go ahead and click the button. Did I add actions to it? I didn't add actions to it. Ha, this is why we test. So my actions for this button will be an insert rows into our behind the scenes history table. And we want to do it from source data. We want to do it from our review request linked input tables. And I'm going to, let's see, column value matches criteria, and marked for review is equal to true. And there we want our domain term, definitions, review comments, and then our status will be a formula. It's going to be, if it's marked for approval, then it'll be approved, otherwise it will be declined. And then we want our request ID to input and term ID input to match our source columns. So request ID and term ID. Okay, now that we've done that, we're ready to approve and decline. Yay! Now we can see that our business glossary should have more terms. Some of them were being edited, and there was a new term, so we have new terms available to us. If we were wanting to do this in the real world, things that you might add would be RLS, row level security, to restrict which users can see or submit requests for which terms. Perhaps every user can see all the terms, or maybe there's a subset of restricted terms that not everyone needs to see. You could also use user attributes or Sigma teams to restrict who can see and interact with the review page. It would be best practices to not allow users to review their own requests. And we probably want to be sure the reviewer is appropriate for the request, for example, in the same domain. We could also add notifications if we were making a more robust app. Like if a request has been submitted, assigned reviewers could be notified via email. Wasn't that easy? I'll see you next time for more Sigma challenges.